Thank you. Am I heard? Is this? Hello? Yeah, nice. Let me begin by saying, the cordialities. Thank you, Amnesty, for organizing this, and thank you for the Faculty of Social Sciences. Thank you all for being here today. It doesn't go unnoticed that your time is valuable. Today, I hope that we're also able to find moments of knowledge exchange as opposed to me going on a monologue. So I hope that, if some things are unclear, you just take some notes and perhaps we can open up the space for discussion afterwards. Just to give a background on who I am, I'm Majd Nasrallah. I'm a cultural practitioner and I've worked in political formation for years. I come from an area called the Triangle, which is a cluster of Palestinian towns in what is known today as Israel. And I have been traveling around the Balkans utilizing this moment, this historic moment of Palestine, which seems to mobilize, which seems to bring together, people of different diverse backgrounds and diverse ideologies to find a moment of intersection, which I find very precious. And what I've been attempting to do is just to kind of create a political moment in which there is a better contextualized understanding of what Palestine is, perhaps to create better strategies to be in solidarity or in accomplishment or as allies to basically prevent these horrors. I think the idea to begin with here is I'm really not here to appeal to anyone's humanity, and I'm not here to present Palestine as some topic that we can just move on from. I would hate to be this tokenized Palestinian speaker that just comes to relay some form of information on you. And the truth is, in this era where there's been a devaluation of the Palestinian life, where there has been a complete dehumanization of what it means to be Arab and Palestinian, I think it's very important for us to break down things to the human level and to see how we can approach this. So what I will try to attempt to do today is provide this context, is to show how Israel is not a democracy as it claims to be. It has never been a democracy. In today's political kind of abstractions, sometimes we get caught up with what the Palestinian cause is, and I'm here to say that the cause for Palestine is not that of borders or statehood. It's not that of national identity or ethnic background as such. It is a human cause. It's a cause for justice, emancipation, and liberation. And so today, what I will be attempting to create is this kind of political halo to understand this aura, to kind of understand what is occurring right now. But before we all start, I think it doesn't, I don't think I'm in a position right now to talk about the brutal reality that we all see. I think whatever is unfolding on your TV screens is enough to show you the horrors of extermination of an entire population, of an entire people. When we find ourselves looking at images of human flesh being put in plastic bags and weighed with kilograms to know if this is a child or this is an adult, to be, when we see these pictures of images of infants under the rubble, and when we hear these crazy numbers of 20,000 children killed, half of which are between the ages of 0 to 1. When we're talking about an attack on a population, when we say Gaza is 2.2 million, we're talking about 1 million children underneath the age of 18. So this is a genocide against children. And I hope, the previous session was able to lay the framework, the legal framework of what genocide is, among other things. So I will try to attempt to build on that in some sense. And again, when I say I'm not here to appeal to humanity, 1 year rolling into this genocide with all these images coming out, with all this systematic, we're talking about camps of torture. We're talking about animals that are trained to rape. We're talking about, you know, these horrors. And at this point, the thing is not about trying to convince anyone, but rather for those who are pro-humanity to understand how they can move forward with this. But before we begin, I ask that we all stand up for a moment of silence for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Syrians, and others that have been victim to this oppression. Thank you. So the structure that I've chosen for today goes as following. At first, I will try to contextualize, as I said, the physical and objective realities of what oppression means to Palestinians and how it's practiced, what domination of one population over the other means. And to do so, I will just go through a brief history of what settler colonialism means, what we mean by occupation, what we mean by apartheid in terms of law and in practice. And following that, I will give my opinion on the objective conjunctural moment, this historic moment in which we all exist, and the dangers and repercussions of this, with outlooks on the future. And I will try to end on a note in which allows us to imagine and allows us to take some ownership and agency over the steps we can take next as individuals and as collectives. So when we talk about just, you know, I think it's important, I'm sure perhaps some of you know the geography of Palestine, but I thought before we begin, just so that things have a clear reference, I wanted to give you a representation of how geography is divided, because when we talk about oppression, we talk about two layers in which this oppression is practiced before we get into the nuance of it, and these are geography and legal status. So Palestinians are divided into different categories in an attempt to not create for them a one political horizon, one horizon of liberation, and to keep them consumed in their own micro struggles and micro ecologies. Now, when we hear about Palestine, when we hear about the two-state solution, we see, as I'll get to in a second, what it means to dominate the land first. So what we have in 1946 is basically Palestine as it was in British Mandate, which is right after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the control of European colonial forces, mainly the British and the French, which divided up the region into these smaller nation states modeled on European nation states, but mainly to continue the domination and control of the area for the benefit of empire and, you know, for the resources and oil and so on and so forth. So when we talked about when post-World War II and upon the creation of the UN Charter, what we hear about is the partition plan that was proposed in 1947 to give the Jewish people a homeland and to allow Arabs, not Palestinians, to exist as non-Jews in the rest of the land. As you see, the geography that's here substantially was smaller, even on the grayer parts, which is where, you know, if we look at that reduced dark area, that is what was left after the war in 1948, where the Armistice Agreement is drawn. So when we talk about military occupation, we're talking about that area, which was, so in this area, where Israel maintained its control, what was left of Gaza and the West Bank were under the Egyptian rule and the latter under the Jordanian rule. And so when we talk about military occupation, what we're talking about is post-67, when Israel militarily occupied both the West Bank and Gaza. And when you fast forward to 2012, 2010, we can see that the control over land even went further beyond into Palestine. The little circled colors is where the Palestinian populations are in the West Bank, but it doesn't show the Palestinians inside of Israel as such, which we will get to. So when we talk about the birth of Zionism as an ideology, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with some of this background, some of this context, it's important to understand that Zionism was born as an ideology that promoted the self-determination of the Jewish people. But the context in which it was born was that of anti-Semitic Europe. And so for the Europeans, for the British, this kind of unholy alliance was created in which basically secular atheist Jewish people promoted this idea of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, this, on the one hand, was supported by European nations, not only relying back on the history of the church itself, Protestant church primarily, which found, this kind of messianic projection of the Jewish people going back to the land of Palestine, this millennial, on the millennia of, bringing back Christ. So we find roots of Zionism early on in the Christian church, but in the late 19th century, this idea of Jewish self-determination birthed in Europe was obviously also influenced by the pogroms that the Jewish population was subject to in Eastern Europe at the time, but also the discrimination that they faced in the different states of Western Europe. And so, on the one hand, we understand what, this unholy alliance of anti-Semitic creation, right? So the Europeans, the Jewish question in Europe was solved by, promoting this idea of the Jewish homeland. But what made it more pertinent is the notion of imperialism and empire. So the British found that it was very relevant for them to have a power in the middle of what is today called the Middle East, and so that they continue to have and exert this kind of control on the ground with some form of allyship with a population that understood them, looked like them, came from that background, had these, political ideologies of socialism or communism or even, capital. So there was this similarity that allowed for this project to really take form and shape as we know it. But what needs to be understood is that Zionism started off as a supremacist political ideology. It's an ideology that promotes and favors the Jewish nation over another. And what that means politically is that they were uninterested and unkeen in any form of participation with the local indigenous population in creating any form of polity, of democracy, of governance as such. And I say this because post-World War I, up until World War II, many of the nations in the area were striving for self-determination, to creating their nation states, to breaking away from empire. And when the Zionists arrived, the indigenous population was also doing as such, as was happening in other places like Iraq and Jordan, and what is today called Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And so this contention began in the early 20th century, in which this idea of a Jewish homeland contradicted with the indigenous population's right to exist. And it was very apparent from the get-go that the Zionist ideologues, the Zionist politicians birthed from the Congress in the late 19th century, were not only not interested, but they had a project of annihilation of the local population, similar to any other colonial projects around the world, such as the ones that were in Algeria, among other places in India, and so on and so forth. But the distinction here is colonialism was attached to a new term, which was settler colonialism. In this case, the outpost is no longer attached, say, to its motherland, such as we saw in South Africa that broke away from the British Empire, such as we saw colonialism in the US, which also settler colonialism in New Zealand and Australia and so forth. And so this was, in its DNA, it was a settler colonial project. And as such, it was premised on the idea of providing, as I said, a political establishment for one ethno-religious category, exclusion, not only the exclusion of the local native indigenous population, but the complete eradication of it, the complete getting rid of it. And this is what we talk about when we talk about ethnic cleansing as a crime. For the state of Israel to be birthed in the way Zionism wanted it to be, they had to take as much land as possible with as less people as possible. And what I attempt to put here when we talk about extermination, we need to understand that in the earliest 20th century, so again between World War I and World War II, there was many attempts by the local population to create a unified government. There was many attempts to even partition the land, but in a way that was favorable to both. But that wasn't true. And there's a myth that is promoted by the Zionist forces around the world up until today that this was an empty land. What I chose to put here as a picture is the local population in their revolt in 1936 when they saw that now there's more Jewish immigration happening. I used the picture just to show that there was an active resistance to this project, that there was a population that did come with its own cultural identity, with its own cultural history, and as I said, because I wanted to talk about fragmentation and repression through subjugation and through, as I started, how today this matrix of oppression, micro struggles, everyone. What I attempted to show with this picture that there was a unity, that there was one political identity for that region, one cultural identity, that were not fragmented as such. And so it's important to recognize Zionism as that, as a settler colonial establishment that excluded the native population, but furthermore was hell-bent on ethnically cleansing them so that they're not part of this European model nation state. And so that's where the story of Palestine, modern Palestine as we know it, begins. In 1948, the use of the systematic and, by the way, I was asked to make a PowerPoint presentation, but I thought, it's you guys are scholars or in the process of being scholars, so I'm not going to sit here and outline to you all these different laws and programs, et cetera. I urge you all to further explore the things I say and to do, don't take things I say for granted, but do look it up. So by 1948, the Israeli militias, the Irgun, the Stern Gang, and the Haganah had followed a plan called Plan Dalit. And the plan was very systematically clear how to get rid of the native population in a way that was very structured, in a way where they'd already gathered information on the entire population and was able to create these massacres in 1948 that ended up driving more than 800,000 Palestinians out of historic Palestine or out of British Mandate Palestine. And today, those 800,000 Palestinians are the ones who are in exile, almost 7.5 million of them around the world. And there was the complete erasure of more than 530 Palestinian cities and villages to create this new state. And so, we talk a lot about, we hear terms like apartheid and military occupation, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so on and so forth, and they all seem to be abstracted to different, to different structures. But what I'm attempting, or what I want to attempt in this contextualization is to show, when we talk about military occupation, we're not just talking about this distant entity, we're talking about military occupation that will later help us understand what apartheid is in this region. And so, in practice, the West Bank, as I've shown it, is under the complete hegemony and domination of the Israeli military. So there is no civil state in that place. 2.9 million Palestinians that exist in the geography of the West Bank, which is 22% of historic Palestine, are under the complete subjugation of the military apparatus, which means that they don't have a state from which their civil and political rights is derived from, which means that the entire establishment is regulated by military officers, by military courts, and so on and so forth. In practice, what this really means is that there's no, on the one hand, the West Bank, or what's left of it, has no access to its own resources, its own water, its electricity. Everything is regulated by the military apparatus, and so you don't have an autonomous economy that might in some way substantiate a state as such. Even the taxation system is governed by Israel, so everything that comes in terms of goods that is supposed to be sent to the West Bank is all regulated by the Israeli state. Even the taxes that you pay have to go to Israeli banks before they return back to you. The control over the area means its space is controlled, its borders are controlled. It means that to navigate, when we talk about this restriction of movement, we're talking about a very intricate urban system that was created to support the transfer of 1 million 1 million Israeli Jews into into the territory of the West Bank. And this, under international law, well, we talked about in 1967, military occupation is supposed to be, in some senses, legal. But the legality of it comes with a very ambiguous loophole, which is the indefiniteness, right? So that a state has the right to military occupy, but it doesn't set a time frame for when that military occupation should end. However, this year, just earlier, a few months ago, the ICJ ruled that the military occupation of the West Bank is illegal as such. And is illegal because of the transfer of the Israeli citizen into these areas. And unlike the local Palestinian population that is governed by the military apparatus, the settlers, as they're called, are subject to civil law, and they're subject to the Israeli civil institution, they're subject to the Israeli water systems and resources and electricity. And to maintain the presence and safety of the settler community and the settler population, which is hell-bent on really ethnically cleansing as much Palestinians as possible, there's a very intricate urban design of highways and streets and an apartheid wall that stretches more than 750 kilometers and almost 12 meters high. I'm sure perhaps some of you have already come in engagement or interface with how that looks, which means that on the local level, these communities, these Bantustans, these closed-off, cantonized urban communities are unable to, first of all, travel amongst themselves in the territory that's supposed to be theirs. Since October 7th, all of these gates have been locked. These communities need to find alternative routes between the villages and the center cities where the economy is. And so restriction of movement is something that is instituted as a very direct show of force, that you cannot move among your own population, among your own territory indefinitely, but is also there primarily for the protection of the settler community, right? And this comes down also to these tactics of punitive measures, in which they will lock off a city just to exert dominance and just to exert their control over it. But restriction of movement also is extended to beyond the geography of Palestine. So also leaving the West Bank is a strenuous process that requires, Israeli permits and so on and so forth. The picture here I put is just the compilation of this is 3 days after October 7th, and I'm just intending to show you the brutality and the aggressive nature of what military occupation is. It is not only military courts, but it is the very arsenal of military equipment. It's the very, very basic structure of physical violence on this sense. And mind you, there was a law that was passed just 2 days ago, or yesterday, that allows for the detention or the imprisonment of children up until the age of 2 for life. Israel is the only state in the world that tries children in military courts. And the system of of detention and repression means that any political attempt at assemblage or any political attempt at pushing back at the settlers is obviously repressed immediately. What this means is today there's more than 11,000 political prisoners in the Israeli system, more than 50% of which are under administrative detention. So I don't know if this was covered earlier, but administrative detention is a system of arrest which you are not told what your charge is. So you go to prison with no charge and no lawyer to defend you, and this, by international law, is actually legalized for 6 months. So what they do is every 6 months, they renew your military detention. So today, I also urge you to go and look at what the prison system for Palestinians is under military. It's very degrading, it's very dehumanizing. It doesn't fall under, it is not regulated by the rules of war. And there's an entire system of dehumanization. When I mentioned rape camps, I really, like, if you haven't been familiar with this, there is systematic sexual assault on both men and women in these establishments. And so this is just a brief kind of background. I urge you, again, all to get a more detailed view, but as I said, this is something I leave to you. I just wanted to give what the structure is. So there's a military occupation of the West Bank, again. To tie this in, what is lesser known to many people is that when the war of 1948 ended, and when there was almost 800,000 Palestinians in exile, and almost today, as I said, I think 3.9 million Palestinians in the West Bank, there's almost 2 million Palestinians inside of Israel, what they're referred to as Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? So after 1948, what ended up happening is, Israel did not finish the job, according to the own, to the own literature and memoirs of people like Ben Gurion, etc. So there was almost 200,000 Palestinians that remained in what became known as Israel. And immediately there was a conundrum that faced the Israeli state, the just-born Israeli state. We have an Arab population who's not Jewish, and mind you, for those who don't know, Israel does not have a constitution. It has a Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, it makes it very clear that all laws are extracted from the Jewish collective character. And so there's Jewish and non-Jewish. That is the legal differentiation of people, and the only people within the bounds of the state that have rights to collectivity are the Jewish nation. As such, the ones that remained became seen as a threat. And immediately it was, how do we subjugate, how do we psychosociologically engineer a community that is not a threat to our security and that is completely devoid of any political substance that relates them to Palestine. And so there was an entire policy and legislative attack on what it means to create a new identity for these Palestinians. And immediately it became known as the Arab Israelis. So it was a very direct attempt to divorce this population from the rest of what is considered the Palestinian nation as such. And we were constantly seen as the fifth column of the state, so a demographic threat to the state of Israel. Hence, there was a myriad, there was a concert of laws that discriminate against the Palestinians, both directly and indirectly. Those are also found online. There's more than 63 identified laws that discriminate against the Palestinian population, or the Arab population as such. And mostly those revolve around three things. So as I said, the first one was land. Land is a very important aspect of the settler colonial institution. And so before 1948, 93% of the land of Palestine was privately owned. The Zionist project had only owned 6.5%. And so all of it was then transferred into what became known as the JNF, or the Jewish National Fund, which is a fund basically that promotes the development of the Jewish nation. So it's a quasi state institution. It's not really a state institution, but it's quasi, and it controls most of the land in tandem with what is called the Israeli Land Administration. So the first law that I would like to mention is the law that doesn't allow this Jewish fund to sell land to Palestinians. So immediately, to buy land, you have to be Jewish. And today we remain on 3.5% of the land that we privately owned, and this has been the same percentage since 1948. And another, when you look further, there's other laws that promote the development of Jewish settlements. So you have more than 969 new cities and Jewish settlements since 1948, and 0 Arab ones, 0 Palestinian ones. To take this a step further, you know, even as a Palestinian, if you want to leave your village that, you know, has now been restricted in its movement in a certain, you know, so yeah, you know, extend me your patience, because sometimes it gets hard to project my own reality onto, you know, listeners. Sometimes I'm also confronted by the oppression that I live. And so this is not just material, this is my life. So you know, extend me some patience because there's so much to get into, and I'll try my best to condense it, which is also doing it an injustice. And so what's very important to note as well when we talk about land, not only the discrimination, but the Palestinian population was highly an agricultural community. So there was this attachment to land that was a form of livelihood, and that was the understanding of what land was to us. And suddenly we lost all that land, so that there was a certain rupture that happened in our very basic identity to what we are as Palestinians, immediately translated into manual laborers, immediately becoming workers for our Jewish masters as such. And so to pick up, there's another law. So as I said, there's a law that allows for the development of new urban infrastructures for Jewish populations on our land. But there's another law called the Selection Committee, which means that each town can create a committee to accept who gets to live in this committee. And to be accepted into this new community, you have to fit the characteristics of the community, which are Jewish. So this means that I cannot go live in a settlement built on my land as a citizen because I'm non-Jewish. Furthermore, to make matters even muddier, so not only does the state not support another law called the priority law, which is pouring taxation money into developing these communities, so not only is that not going into my community, not only am I unable to live on these new communities, but furthermore, my community on its land is restricted in where it's able to build. And so I'll give an example before I get into the demolitions of my hometown, which I mentioned. Qalansuwe, where I'm from, is initially almost 32,000 dunams. A dunam is 1,000 meters squared. This was before 1948. Following 1948, when we lost our land to the JNF, we were left with 7,000 dunams. Of the 7,000 dunams, we only had access to build on 3,000. Now, this was in 1948, when the population of Qalansuwe was 2,400 people. Today, it's close to 25,000 people. So you see how this small area of what used to be a village is somehow turned into a ghetto space, a ghetto urban space, which means that if you want to attempt to build your livelihood, to build a house for your own safety and security on your private land, which is not designated as urban, the state will come and demolish it. So Qalansuwe was subject to this demolition process. You know, as I said, I said there's 7,000, we can only build on 3,000. If I build on any part of the 4,000, the state has the right to come and demolish my house. And they've made it easier by this new law called the Kamenetz law, which basically maneuvers around the legal system. It appoints one minister with a committee that decides if your house is to be destroyed or not. Now, the picture I chose is that of a town in the Naqab, which is the southern part of the state. This town has been demolished 240 times as we speak. And just to give further context, the Palestinian population inside of the state of Israel is divided into 3 geographies and 4 subcategories. I know there's a lot of details, so please take, whatever questions we can expand on later. And so the 3 geographies are the Galilee in the north, the Triangle where I'm from, which is in the heart of the state. So my town is almost 20 kilometers away from Tel Aviv. So we're literally a geostrategic location, and then there's the Naqab where the Bedouin nomads are. And this is the town in the Naqab. And so we're subject to these demolition, so as I said, so it's very repressive on all forms just in terms of the livelihood. Now, to make matters even more extreme, there's other laws that regulate what kind of social life you have. So there's a law that says that it's illegal for me to marry a spouse from the West Bank, or a spouse from Gaza, or a spouse from 80% of the Arab world. This is illegal. So if I fall in love with someone in Ramallah or in Nablus, I'm unable to naturally, legally marry them. And so there's, as I said, there's this concert of all these laws, and to talk about more, there's 70% of the opportunities provided to you in terms of jobs or education are limited by another law, which is the military law, right? So you will get benefits in 70% of institutions if you served in the military, which is an obligation for all citizens of the states except us. Today, we're 20% of the state, right? So we're, as I said, 1/5 of the state. And we don't join the army, which is this kind of subverted way of saying, well, you're not going to get the benefits left from all, the benefits of different jobs, different positions in government, and so on and so forth. And as I said, there's an ocean of these different details, but I will end on one that has to do with our political beingness today. So while it's true that we have access to, and these are the two privileges we seem to have. One is travel, that's how I'm here today. So I have an Israeli passport, which means to the world I'm an Israeli. So if someone does something to me in Germany, I'll call anti-Semitism, but that's for a different, So that's one privilege, and the other is this convincing us that we have, the right to vote in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, which is a hoax in many ways because there's a lot of limitations on what a political Arab party can look like. The first thing is you have to swear oath to the state of Israel. You have to swear oath that this is the Jewish state, and this is one of the only ways that you can enter into the parliament. So there's already, these limitations on all these fronts. But what I wanted to highlight before we move on in terms of these repressive practices is all these laws put in place to prevent us from political action. So a law that was passed 2 days ago makes it legal for the state to expel its citizens if they are relatives of a terrorist. So if someone, and by the way, the designation of what terrorist is a very broad, very broad kind of domain, which allows judges, et cetera, to really kind of like on the spot, designate you a terrorist or not. This is very dangerous. So imagine a citizen of Slovenia who's related to someone who hijacked a plane, just to be extreme. You are subject to being legally expelled and revoked your citizenship. Another law that has to do with our political repression was also passed after October 7th, which is called the consumption of terrorist content. So as a citizen, if I like content online that is supposed to promote terrorism, which is resistance, I'm liable to criminal charges of up to 1 year in prison. Furthermore, and even more worrying, is a law that was passed that allows the police to take decisions to shoot live ammunition at protests and assemblages that are a threat to the state. Again, this is a very broad term. And so when we look at, Palestinians in Israel today, we can see why there is such a stagnation. And there is this complete absentization from the political project for liberation, mostly because we are subject to all these laws. But identity, as I said, and I hope I'll get, this is something that I usually expand more on, is the crux of this, is identifying us as Arab Israelis and not Palestinians. And, some of us have taken agency over that, so I call myself Palestinian from Heartland Palestine, and I refuse to, I choose what, I choose the agency to describe who I am. And so this is also just a glimpse of of the repressive practices of Palestinians in Heartland. And the reason why I put those is to show you the first two blocks of what apartheid means. So apartheid is not only the system of what they consider proper Israel, but also the annexed part, which is the West Bank, which is under the military occupation. All the Jewish population in all of historic Palestine has Jewish privilege by merit of being Jewish, and everything that is non-Jewish is subject to all these different legal distinctions. And one last thing, another subcategory, because this is what's important, right? I know it's a complex, you know, they say, oh, Palestine is such a complex issue. The only thing complex about it is this matrix of oppression. That's it. It's how oppression is practiced, which is so complicated. But the cause is very, you know, it's very clear. In any case, so Palestinians in 48, or in Heartland, are also divided into Christian, Druze, Bedouin, and Muslim, and they each have a different relationship with the state. So it's this further fragmentation of our identities to create a micro relationship to our master, to our oppressor, so that we don't find any harmonization of our struggles, even as citizens of the state. To make matters worse, we get to the crown jewel of the struggle of this entire thing, which is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, as designated by the partition plan by the United Nations in 1947, is supposed to be and is meant to be international territory, is meant to be regulated by international forces and not subject to either Israelis or Palestinians. However, in '67, when they occupied Jerusalem, the entire population of the Jerusalemites, Arab Jerusalemites, was now subject to Israeli law. And there's one of the major things that Israel is trying to do today is to Judaize Jerusalem, which they have a plan for 2030, which is to make they're called the 70-30 plan, which is to make 70% of Jerusalem Jewish, and to rid it of its Palestinian population and to limit it to 30%. Now, the way they try to do this in practice is, first of all, the apartheid wall. So the apartheid wall mainly was created to cut off communities that were part of Jerusalem, part of East Jerusalem, cut them off so that they're not part of the civil infrastructure. Jerusalemites don't have citizenship, and they only have what is called temporary residency, which is another practice which says, if you don't prove to us that you live here constantly by showing us your taxes, by showing us that you pay your water bills, by showing us that you pay electricity, which is a strenuous process, by the way, that you have to prove continuously, your residency will be revoked. So if you leave the country to go study elsewhere, you are liable, or you run the jeopardy of being revoked and not being able to come back. And so also East Jerusalemites, unlike Palestinian citizens, have nowhere to vote, they're encouraged to participate in the municipal elections of East Jerusalem, which they boycott, because it's this tactic of trying to normalize that this is a Jewish city. But they're not part of the Palestinian Authority, although, this card of Jerusalem is always put on the table as the nexus of any resolution that might occur. So Jerusalem in this case is very significant to the whole equation. Mostly also because when we talk about ridding it of its native population, we're also talking about these further projects of Judaization. So for instance, I chose this picture, just like the ghettos in Heartland, there's a lot of Palestinians in East Jerusalem are also compiled into these small geographic spaces. This is the neighborhood of Silwan, which is right across the Dome of the Rock. There is a project to destroy this entire neighborhood to make a park for King Solomon of the Bible. So it is the complete erasure of a population to create a park, to create a symbol of further Jewishness of the state. And so I think the major thing here to reference in terms of the East Jerusalemites is the attempt to rid the system of them, in lack of a better term, And they do this using the apartheid wall, and they do this using the temporary residency status. So, we didn't talk about Gaza because Gaza is its own thing, right? Gaza has been a 365 kilometers squared location that has been cut off from the rest of the world for the last 17 years. Cut off in the sense of even a calorie count and nutrition which is allowed to enter. So while it is subject to military rule, like the West Bank, it is subject to military rule on steroids, which means it's way more extreme, there's way more impunity. Since 2018, even more, there's been an attempt to non-violent struggle to break the siege, which was completely met by violence on all fronts. And so Gaza is something that is hard to define in terms of its control because, to put it bluntly, it is literally the biggest ghetto in the world that is surrounded by one of the strongest armies in the world that is preventing it from its basic life and just any amenities to create themselves and to create all this structure that will either annihilate them or kick them out. So these are the three components besides the refugees. So we have the Palestinians in the West Bank, we have the Palestinians in Heartland, we have the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and each one is subject to different legal categories and are subject to different repressive practices. Now, where it gets interesting is that Israel has gone even further beyond these forms of repression. And it has employed, we talked about these laws, we talked about all these things, but to make subjugation easier for the state, it has had to create proxy of the native indigenous population that will basically do the job of repression for it, right? So it's the creation of these groups, it's the creation of these climates in which repressive collectives, repressive, either recognized or not, do the job of completely oppressing the population. Now, in Heartland Palestine, as I said, and this I didn't mention this. When the state was born, from the year the armistice agreement signed in 1949 up until 1966, the Palestinians in Israel were not really citizens yet, but they were subject to martial law. So the first prototype of the military occupation in the West Bank actually started on my community. And one of the most prevalent forms of control that existed at the time is this policy of what is called the sticks and carrots approach, right? And so cut off from the rest of the world, there was also this restriction of movement and calorie count, which is basically to completely dehumanize, to completely degrade the local population to its basic survival, which is just food, right? It was just to exist. They created this massive infrastructure of poverty, an establishment of this matrix, which then was presented with two options. You can either co-optate with your oppressors, your Israeli masters, which is the carrot, which means we invite you to work with us as collaborators, as co-optators, as infiltrators, as spies. That was the first tactic they put into place to create this mistrust among the community and to give these positions to those who wanted to collaborate, either as municipality, mayors, as principals in high school, and so on. And on the other front, the stick, if you wanted to talk about Palestine, if you talked about liberation, national identity, and so on, you got the stick, which meant you were exiled, tortured, blackmailed, and so on and so forth. But the military rule ended in 1966. But these blueprints of identity that were created remained in force. Now, a major point of junction was in 1993 when the Oslo Accords were signed, which completely, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Oslo Accords, but maybe I'll get to that in a second. There's so much to get to. We were completely eliminated by the Palestinians from the Palestinian population. So when the Oslo Accords were signed, which were between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority in 1993, there was zero mention of us as part of the Palestinian population, which is when we began to see a surge of a form of national identity within the Palestinian population in Heartland, or in 48. And between the years 93 and 2000, Israel recognized that this new threat needs to be quelled. So what it did following the Second Intifada, to make sure that the Palestinians in Israel were under control, were neutered, they started pouring drugs and weapons into our communities and strengthening criminal syndicates that now took control over the local population. So when we talk about poverty, we're talking about 50% of the Palestinian population, citizens, live under the poverty line, which means that if you want to go to the bank, for instance, to take a loan to build a house, you don't have credit, which means that you will immediately go to this black market, to the shadow economy, to take money, which is run by these criminal syndicates. And in the vacuum of any form of civil society or cultural life, or even political participations, criminal organizations today run rampant. And there has been many studies that have showed that mob bosses of these criminal gangs are part of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, the Security Intelligence Agency. So they are tightly in bed with the security agency to make sure. And so this transformation that happened was that if you're a collaborator, now you can be given a free pass as a criminal. And so in 2021, when I talk about guns, in 2021, there was a survey conducted by the Israeli parliament itself, 21 or 20, I'm not, and it surveyed more than 600,000 pieces of illegal weapons in this community. 600,000 rockets, RPG, like serious ammunition. And then they discovered that 1/3, and this was the one surveyed. Then they discovered that 1/3 of these weapons were weapons that Israel had already taken and somehow were back on the street. So they're weapons that the police have collected and then somehow found again in the streets and caught again. And so the weapons that they come from the IDF. They come from the Israel Defense Force. And there's, for example, in my hometown, unfortunately, we're talking about 2.3, a percentage of 2.3 guns per household. We're talking about a creation of an entire criminal culture, so that we are so devoid of any political substance of liberation. We're so divorced, as I said, from the Palestinian struggles, and we're so consumed by this new social fabric created, which is dominated by this crime culture, by this stereotype or archetype of a thug, of a gangster. And I mean, I say all of this to say, like the picture I put is basically these shows that the Israeli military will do every once in a while, which they call mowing the grass. So another repressive law is the one where Israel does not have to issue a court order to get a warrant. The police has full control or complete autonomy or authority to choose a house and raid it with no court order, just as it has the right to stop and frisk any Palestinian with no real definition of threat. And so I mention this to say that these groups of criminals have become the ones terrorizing the Palestinian population since October 7th. And just to give you an idea of what social engineering or psychological engineering of a community means, since since the genocide started, with every form of practice that I talked about earlier in terms of shooting at live protests, the consumption of terrorist, with all that aside, the social fabric has meant until today, so since October 7th until today, there has been 222 homicides in the Palestinian community. I don't know if this is something that, you know, catches attention, but it is to say that there's, you know, they've succeeded, unfortunately, into creating this completely neutered community that has no political, and it's precisely because we're in the belly of the beast. There's 2 million of us today. We are a major threat to their political establishment. And so, yeah, so this is to show the step beyond in which control takes form over the human population, over the collective. Now, the same is similar to the West Bank. You know, a lot of us here, we hear about Palestinian statehood. Slovenia, for example, accepted Israel, Palestinian right to statehood, but they accepted it on the premise of the Palestinian Authority. Now, to give context, in 1987, there was the first Palestinian revolution called the Intifada. It was a nonviolent movement that took place mostly in the West Bank, which was confronting the military occupation that was very prevalent at the time. Now, Israel and the US, Jordan, they all needed someone to speak to in the form of negotiations to quell this revolution. And what happened at the time, the political establishment of militant Palestinian representatives, or the PLO, was abroad. And there was a new body that was created, which is the Palestinian Authority. And what happened was the Palestinian Authority, which was not, by the way, given a mandate by any Palestinian. So nobody in the West Bank voted for it. Nobody in Heartland was part of it. Nobody in Refugee was part of this. This is a completely constructed body, unrepresented, it doesn't have the mandate. It wasn't given a mandate by anyone, which politically recognized Israel's right to self-determination, recognized Israel as the Jewish state, but in return, Israel only recognized the Palestinian Authority. So they didn't recognize Palestine or Palestine's right to exist. And since '93, when these were signed, up until today, first of all, more than 600,000 Israeli settlers are now in the West Bank. And in the last 30 years, what this force has done, so today we're talking the Palestinian Authority, more than 53% of its fiscal budget goes on security. Less than 1% goes on culture. This is in the West Bank, right? This is in the, I don't know if you know, but Oslo created a 3-tier system, geographically speaking, in the West Bank. There's Areas A, Areas B, and Area C. Area C is 60% of the West Bank, which is now where the settlers are. Area A, which is 2% of historic Palestine, is where the Palestinian Authority is supposed to have authority. That's 2% of Palestine. Those are basically the cities. And today, we're talking about a force of more than 70,000 armed militants that are part of the Palestinian Authority that are trained by the CIA on tactics of repression. And so today, I don't know if you hear about this, but the resistance factions in places like Jenin camp or Nablus or anything that is occurring in the West Bank is first repressed by the Palestinian Authority, right? So it's become this cheap proxy of maintaining occupation, similar to the gangs in Heartland. These have become the proxy agents of the State of Israel, militarily speaking, so that the military doesn't even have to do its job so directly. This is an armed force that does it. So here I took a picture. This is not an Israeli soldier, but that is a used Israeli car. So they get all the used equipment from the Israeli army, and they become the Israeli army. Like they become the oppressor, and this is them entering a camp to arrest Palestinian resistance fighters to hand them over to Israel. This is common practice. Since October 7th until today, the Palestinian Authority has killed 17 Palestinians. That's crazy. They have become the oppressive force. They are the force that does Israel's dirty job in the West Bank, and they are trained on repression. So while they do have guns, I mean, only 1 week after October 7th, the Palestinian Authority, and that's why we don't see protests in the West Bank, by the way. 1 week after, there was a conglomeration of young people that flooded the street. The Palestinian Authority shot and killed a 14-year-old with live ammunition, with no impunity, of course. Right, and this goes unheard of because the PA is acting as this force that is quelling any attempt at any political participation, hence it's dangerous for different states to recognize Palestinian statehood on this basis. The only democratic elections or process of elections that happened was in 2006, and Hamas won, and Hamas was alienated to Gaza. And since there has been no political process for giving mandate to the Palestinian Authority to be the representative of the Palestinian population. And they're highly reliant on funds, obviously, from across, from the EU and so on and so forth. They are trained by the Germans on, police conduct and whatnot, etc. I hope that wasn't prolonged, but that was me trying to contextualize forms of practice, either through law or either through creation of these psychosocial environments for self-oppression. Now, to bring it back to now, I won't lie, but things are going to get worse. That is how it's looking. Things are going to get worse. And if this is the unfortunate reality, at least in my observation, if we begin to look, first of all, at the rise of fascism, either in the West, in European states or in the US, that is our first alarm that goes off. When we talk about censorship, there's clearly this weaponization of anti-Semitism as a criminal offense, and this equation or equating of anti-Jewishness to anti-Zionist. We see in Germany this is something that has become so intense and so severe, and so there is this immediate threat on your own political rights, the right to freedom of expression, the right of freedom of assembly, and so on. And these are, to begin with the wider context, these are very, very scary alarms that are going off. And I say this to say that when I say things are going to get worse, the Israeli government, not only now, but for most of its time, has made it very clear that again, back to land, it's an annexationist project. It's a project of ethnic cleansing. And so it's been very clear that they have an agenda. Since there's no going back to what was before October 7th, they have this agenda to now go full force in their annexation and in their ethnic cleansing. We see this happening in North Gaza as we speak. There's nothing left in Jabalia. There's nothing left in northern Gaza. We see the passing of a law that's going to happen in 2025 as promoted by Smotrich, which is the annexation of the West Bank legally. We see this happening in southern Lebanon, and we have been we've come in interface very directly, and this is not some extremist factions, this is not some kind of like hocus pocus, real. They are talking about rearranging the map and creating a greater Israel. This is not a hoax. I mean, major politicians in government said this and have been saying this. And I think this is a moment that they're utilizing to create this rearrangement, to take more control, and to do more ethnic cleansing on Palestine. And this is a very real thing. It's a very dangerous thing. Now, I want to link this to two things, which is, again, coming back to empire. A major reason why, it is true, and a lot of us might be we can critically kind of discuss this, but it's the anti-Semitic card, which has become institutionally criminalized, right? If you look at the International Holocaust Remembrance, it's a legal document that colleges, universities, states, municipalities are signing, which make it criminal to be critical of Israel. This is a legal document created within the framework or establishment of the United Nations. Nevertheless, in my opinion, I think this is a diversion tactic. And I think the real essence of the support that is going has nothing to do, just like the creation of the state, but it mostly has to do with wealth and resources. It mostly has to do with this next understanding of what energy is. And so, to go back 4 years, Trump, which is now back in government, proposed this thing called the deal of the century, where he was trying to create this shift from self-determination to financial prosperity, in which what was being proposed is pipelines of oil from Saudi Arabia and from the United Arab Emirates that will stretch across the desert and enter Israel, so that Israel becomes a major distributor of energy in the region. They will have the faucet of oil, of Arab oil, right? And this was a big part of why also, the claims of October 7th is to stop this form of normalization. And so we see the objectives of empire continuing to be a big part of why this annihilation is taking place. That's why I say they try to divert it into this ethno-religious, national situation. It's not Muslims versus Jews, but that card is used to further entrench Islamophobia and to further make it threatening for you to stand up for Palestine, because they've created this paradigm where if you say anything, you're anti-Semitic. But furthermore, I mean, this is a representation, but there's a $500 billion gas pocket right across the shores of Gaza. And it doesn't go unnoticed. That is also part of it. It's right across northern Gaza. And it would be a little bit like, not absurd, but reductivist of us to exclude these factors of why this is happening, right? So when we talk about Greater Israel, it's not just this fanatic, ethnic attempt, messianic. It might be driven by rhetoric of such, or the jargon of it, but also in essence, it's an imperialist project. It's one that wants to extract more resources and wealth for empire and to destroy any form of creating a region that can be threatening to Europe or to the West. Lastly, I end with what we can do. So I mentioned a grim reality in the slide before, but at the same time, I think since there has been complete disregard to the international system created post-World War II, since we've seen the complete impotence of Security Council resolutions, we've seen the complete impotence of the ICC and ICJ processes of justice, we've seen this complete disregard to it. And this is, again, a signifier that none of these structures will probably continue. Now, this is, again, speculative, but I believe that there is a new era that's being ushered in terms of international structures, international establishments. And in regards to the Israeli genocide, since I said they already have this expansionist project, they've already claimed it, then I think it's time for Palestinians as well to stop talking within the framework of this international jargon, international language, right? So it's not a question of human rights, it's not a question of creating a state, it's not a question of a solution, it's a question of dismantling oppressive fascist ideology. Now, with that being said, I think there's a lot of space, not only for Palestinians, but the community, the international community at large, to come back to its humanist, into its very basic human existence, one that is based on love and not fear, right? And so when we talk, if you're able to see that this threat is also going to be spreading in your communities, then we begin to see that Palestine is not this distant, just this distant conflict that needs to be resolved, but rather it's an apex. It's at the apex of the human project, what we want to live in as free individuals, as free collectives, and so on. And so my proposition is that we are daring and courageous enough to say we want to promote a new living otherwise. What is living otherwise? What is, defining, freedom and so on? What does solidarity mean in practice? And how can we utilize, cultural and academic institutions such as this one in a way that say, we have already charted our principles, and a lot of them, are about acceptance, freedoms, rights, and so on. But how are these being put into practice? Why are these institutions being so quiet, in a sense, when it comes to the genocide that's happening? And what role can we play in reconfiguring these already existent structures in terms of cultural organizations, in terms of artistic productions, in terms of academic institutions or research institutions, to make them live up to their work, live up to their principles? And I think it is time, and I think we should be courageous enough to propose a new way of being, right? And not to revert back, especially for the region. Like it makes no sense to have a free Palestine on British mandate Palestine, which was already a colonialist project. And so it's time perhaps for us, at least in the region, to think beyond nation states. But as far as I would like to go for this session, and I hope it wasn't too long, is imagination, is opening up to space to see that we can utilize different tools that are at our disposal and to be active agents in the creation of our objective reality, and not just be passive with all this, the global dangers that are sweeping across the Western world, but also the global South, and so on and so forth. And so, I don't know if you know, but this is a picture of one of the concerts for pro-Palestine in Belgrade in '82. I think the group was called Electric Orgasm. And I put it just to say that, yes, we can find, there's a beauty and there's pleasure in being subjects in our own freedom and the creation and the crafting of our own reality. I urge you all to actually see the power that you inhibit and how you can manifest it. And I actually invite you all to see yourselves not just in solidarity with Palestine, but accomplices in this creation of a new political reality. Thank you. I mean, I know it's a big hall, but if there's any comments or questions, yeah, please.
Thank you very much for a very well-structured and deeply disturbing presentation. A lot of questions came up, but I would just only ask two. One, you mentioned the hoax of the voting power, voting right, the Israeli parliament, but also, if I understand correctly, most of the Israeli political parties are deeply rooted in an inherently discriminatory ideology, that is Zionism. So does Palestine currently have any allies on the Israeli political stage? And I don't mean just those that are maybe against the current occupation because they want to see the hostages brought back, but those that would actually be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And then the second question would be, actually, if you can maybe just answer this first one.
Absolutely. But to get to the answer, I want to say that I personally understand the necessity of creating these allyships, especially if we look at places like South Africa. A major component of reconfiguring, recalibrating, and dismantling the apartheid system was the white Afrikaners. Now, they weren't the only ones, and they played their own role in the whole equation, but that was part of it. Now, I'm afraid that, Israeli society undergoes two processes of Zionization, not even Judaization, right? The first is in school, and the second is the military. And they're both premised on their otherness to us. And they're both premised on the morality of their privilege, and which is, rooted in this idea of victimhood. Now, unfortunately, the social fabric today as is engineered by the media, as is engineered by, by all these political movements, has shown in different surveys that more than 90% of Israeli society supports the ongoing of genocide. Now that's very troubling, it's very disturbing, but pragmatically understood. No one wants to give up their privilege, right? Especially if it's a construct in their own political imagination that would mean their annihilation. Now this is a continuously injected discourse, so it's continuously being pumped by various actors. But to answer your questions, no, there's very minimal categories or very minimal. There's a minimal percentage of Israeli Jews that are in support of changing. I was personally, for a long time, I used to organize the One Democratic State campaign, which I no longer, believe in as such. But all the Israeli Jewish people that were part of the collective called themselves Palestinian. So that there's a major shift that occurs there. And I think for any political, today there's third and fourth generation Israelis, the descendants of Polish, Lithuanian, British, etc. And the idea is there's no kicking out for anyone. But there needs to be a transitional justice phase in which, the oppressed, us, are the only ones with the power to indigenize this community, right? We are the only ones with that power, but to do so, we have to be free. But yeah, to answer your question bluntly, not really. And even there's maybe one social movement that promotes coexistence, but coexistence is reductivist because it maintains the system of privilege. But it says we won't hurt you if you stay with us. But it doesn't target the heart of it, which was supremacy.
Thank you. And then the other question, how strong is the connection or alignment between the West Bank and Gaza in terms of political thought or political movement, given that Israel works so hard to keep you apart?
There's many layers to answering this. The first would be the political factions. So following 2006, there was a political direction, mainstream political direction in the West Bank to further enhance the capitalist project, right? Which meant this new era of loans, of privatizing market, etc. So it's created this economic reality in which the Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank are more comfortable. And there is, as I said, there are 70,000 armed militants for the PA that repress any form of political reprisal. Now, so on that level, there's a major difference because Hamas, an Islamic resistance faction sent to the West Bank, has a different, more confrontational political nature, right? So in terms of socially, there is absolutely a harmony. We're part of the same nation. There's absolutely this. There's many Gazans in the West Bank, but also inside or heartland Palestine. So on a social level, the fabric is very knit, tied. Politically is where it happens. Politically is where the split occurs. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Hello, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation again. I had a question. Could you maybe tell a bit more about the role of women within this genocide? I was noticing on all of these pictures there are not a lot of women, and also for the one picture where you showed the culture, I believe, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, the culture of Palestinians. There were also just a lot of young people, but all of men, what's that about?
I mean, I think it's a very clear indication that the patriarchal system is very strong back there. I wouldn't be the most equipped to talk about the feminist movement in Palestine, but the feminist movement in Palestine has existed since the 20s. not only as part of the social fabric, but also as resistance groups. Women have played a leading role in creating political discourse, so they're not tokenized as such. They've played leading roles in both armed factions in the 70s, 60s, and 80s, but also in creating political discourse on the ground. Again, it would be reductivist of me to answer as, oh, where do women stand on this? But there is many feminist groups that have been feminists. I mean, women play this major role. But again, I think ending on the living otherwise, it would be important to note that many of the movements that exist in Palestine have a very limited life cycle. And the reason being, one of the reasons being, is they continue to reproduce the same capitalist values: sexist, racist, xenophobic, consumerist, and so on, so they disintegrate. So in the proposition of imagination, my direction is, we would have to heal those scars. Unfortunately, yes, the majority of positions is highly patriarchal. The infrastructure, the establishment, whether in the Palestinian Authority and the criminal gangs, to be honest, is patriarchal. But I think that's also saying that there's a problem, right? So I hope that addresses the question, but to put it very bluntly, women have played major roles not in political parties, but in creating political thought and in creating political discourse and philosophy. And I apologize if that was not, I didn't, that was not something that was, there was no statement that I was making without putting women. Maybe on the future it would be, yeah. Please.
I got a question because you were telling us about all these laws. Okay. Because you were telling us about all these laws that were like signed in. Is there no objective party that has to check these laws to make sure there are no negative external or indirect consequences?
Do you mean inside the civil structure of Israel?
Before, because someone comes up with these laws, and then they should be checked objectively if they can be installed.
I mean, there is a very intricate system in the Israeli parliament in which ratification happens. Now, the Israeli parliament, I believe, I don't remember how many seats, I think it's 120, etc. But most of them are on the far right or middle. They're not even middle center anymore. So there's a system of voting. So they will propose a law, and it will undergo a certain committee, will be proposed again. So the last law to kick out Palestinian citizens, to revoke citizenship, was voted in by majority. So so there is these systems, but they are dominated by majority Zionist ideologues.
Yeah. Thank you again for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. I wanted to circle back to the notion of indigenizing the settler population. Maybe an exercise of imagination. What, in your opinion, what might this look like?
So, I mean, there is no. It's not it's not a linearity that happens where one point has, there's one thing where it's freedom right afterwards. It's a very intricate process. And just like Palestinians have to see their freedom subjectively and not in the binary of their oppressor, similarly, the oppressor has to be put in a position where his privilege is no longer present. Now, we have seen that many settlers, I think close to 700 or 800,000 have left Israel since the war has begun, haven't returned. So the idea of privilege is very fragile in that sense, but I believe that any process as such of humanizing the oppressor is a very integral part of any real revolution, right? But to do this, we have to humanize ourselves first as Palestinians. Now, there needs to be a power structure shift that happens, but my fear is if the loss of privilege is a direct result of that power shift. So there needs to be, you know, it's a very nuanced relationship that happens. But yes, following, you know, we can be creative in proposing what transitional justice looks like here. But indigenization comes when we are free. Now, how we look as free, we don't know. So it's still not about them. You know, our freedom's still not about them. It's about us, you know. It's about us being free, and when we get there, we will understand. So it's still, I don't want to make it about how they will look like, but I want to see a future where collectives and different groups are safe and prosperous and live in equality. Well, I guess that's it, folks. Thank you.